Okay, let's get started. It's time for summer reading, and we're rereading our classic F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender as the Night. So I hope you got your copy. And we're going to start with the easy part. We're going to start with the year that this was written. So this is written in 1934, and we associate Fitzgerald with the 1920s, with the Jazz Age. Of course, that's when Gatsby is set, and most of you have read Gatsby, or if not, you know of Gatsby, and you know that the flappers and New York City and all of these sort of pinpoints, these sort of symbols of the Jazz Age are what was important about that book and about Fitzgerald in general. But this is written in the 30s. So now we're in the Great Depression, and there's something about the sadness here and something about the mercurial rich that is not quite in line with what's going on in America at the time. And so he sets this in the French Riviera for the most part, but there is this callback to especially Hollywood. And during the 30s, Fitzgerald has gone to Hollywood to try to write movie scripts. And 1934, when this is published, is 6 years before his death. And Fitzgerald died of alcoholism complications, most likely cirrhosis of the liver. And so there is this like premonition of doom that kind of is the backdrop to this shiny Riviera moments that are happening throughout the book. And for a lot of people, when this went to market, it didn't sell that many copies. I think it sold something like 12,000 copies in the first 3 months, which was not very good. And like Gatsby, it didn't sell a lot until posthumously, until Fitzgerald passed away, and then it began to sell. Not like Gatsby. It did not become this zeitgeist American book where every generation reads Gatsby and every generation has a new interpretation of Gatsby. And whether it's positive or negative, it doesn't matter. It's still this indictment of the American dream that is pervasive in our culture. Tender as Night is not that book. And it begins even in the title and the idea of what is it to be tender. And, you know, we think of tender as like a tender caress, and it can be very gentle and careful and calming and peaceful. But tender is also raw, and wounds are tender. Meat gets tenderized. And we start to look at these connotations that is the nighttime what is scary? And is it the way we feel when light has disappeared that is who we most truly are as people? And when we move from that darkness, then our relationships are different. Our ways of seeing the world are different. Our ways of being in the world are different. And we are more susceptible both in letting things in, our pores are more tender, but also of what comes out. And so that's kind of some of the themes that Fitzgerald is exploring in here. And of course, he's exploring the mental illness of the main character as putting on his pair of glasses because his own wife, Zelda, of course, suffered from a lot of mental illness. And if you are, you know, at all interested in Fitzgerald, the quintessential book is, of course, Zelda, and written by Nancy Milford. And it is just it's just a powerful statement on the times and also on the woman herself and as a subject of that time period, and where creative energy was allowed to go and wasn't allowed to go, and why she became a muse to F. Scott and how that was also a burden for her. And within this story, you'll see some of those echoes of that relationship between the main character, Dick Diver, and his wife Nicole, of course. But rarely, when you go into the dedication page, you see that it's not dedicated to Zelda. It is dedicated to Gerald and Sarah, it says, and many fetes, which of course means many parties. And this is his friends, the Murphys. And Hemingway, of course, you know, notorious compadre of Fitzgerald's, and also critic of Fitzgerald, says that's where the problem was in this novel. He didn't stay with that idea of the Murphys as being the primary characters long enough. He went off on a tangent in terms of looking at Zelda, but once the book became about Zelda, that's when Hemingway lost interest, and he said it became a lot more autobiographical and less interesting. Now, I totally disagree. I think that that's what makes the book special. I think it's a statement on mental illness and a statement on the doctor-patient relationship, on ethics and morality, on the infatuation with youth and youth culture that has begun with Hollywood and continues to this day. As we look at the Met Gala and we look at movie stars and pop stars and the desire for youth in our culture, that youth in women especially is prized above all things, above wisdom, above artistry, above creativity. And the themes in here become darker and more mature, and you see that Fitzgerald is actually trying to flesh out characters and flesh out story in a way that Gatsby was more of a sketch of a time period, even though it had these very strong themes and discussions about the American dream. This is really a character study versus trying to set a scene in New York at a certain time period. So when you open the very first page, you have an epitaph here, and it says, "Already with thee, tender is the night, but here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways," which is, of course, John Keats is from an ode to a nightingale. And so when you think about a nightingale, the sort of voice in the dark that's singing, again, you have to determine as you read, who is that voice in the dark? Who is it that Fitzgerald's following? Who is it that Dick Diver is following as the main character? And when you stand and you listen, when Keats is in writing Ode to Nightingale, he's standing and he's listening to this nightingale and he's thinking about time and death and human suffering, and he wants to escape. But when the nightingale flies away, he feels as if he's waking from a dream. And it's this vision that he has in the waking of a dream that's actually the most magical part of the whole scenario. So it's not the real voice of the nightingale, it's the vision of the nightingale that's more powerful. And so when you look at the reality of humanity, sometimes it's not who our loves are in their daily life and with their flaws and their smells and their anger and their more distasteful emotions. It's our imagination of them, or our expectation of them, or our memory of them, or our vision of them that becomes more powerful and more connected to how we feel about them than the reality or the truth of them. And that's why the nighttime visions are the more tender visions, and the daytime visions are what people struggle with. And you'll see that in the relationships between the divers, where who they are and can be together in quiet and night and in exploring darkness is more manageable than who they are in the daytime, mentally ill, alcoholic, whatever it is. And that's where the struggle between characters comes. So the idea of the first as best is also something that is pervasive in Fitzgerald and also in most literature. I mean, when you think about The Outsiders, and most of us memorize that Frost poem because of The Outsiders. Nature's first green is gold, her heart is few to hold, her early leaves a flower, but only for an hour. So leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. And that mantra of the first is best is also echoed here, as you'll see in the first 50 pages, you'll see it. But it's also this idea of, like Adam and Eve in Garden of Eden, right? Created in perfection, but leads to the fall. So you want to sort of carry those ideas with you as you move forward. Now, in terms of what you need to know as you're reading, need to know is subjective. These are, what I'm suggesting to you is just a pair of glasses to put on as you're reading the book. It's not what you're necessarily going to get out of it. It's not the right thing. It's not what Fitzgerald was thinking. It's just this idea of reading a little more closely, reading with a certain point of view in mind that I'm encouraging you to do. So one of the major themes in the book is narcissism. So you want to have an understanding of what that is. You want to have an understanding of what narcissism is from a psychological point of view, but also from maybe the myth of Narcissus in Greek mythology. So obviously it's a personality disorder where the person's ego center is so pervasive that they can only channel the world through their own perception of it and do not have empathy for others in the same way. So the question becomes, is the narcissist the psychiatrist, or is the narcissist the patient, or is it their relationship with each other that informs these narcissistic sensibilities? And then the Greek myth, of course, Narcissus falls in love with an image of himself. So that is also something you want to keep in mind as you're reading. You have this brilliant psychiatrist who has this beautiful patient that he's attracted to and he's interested in, and you have this sort of manic pixie dream girl thing in the 90s, like if those of you lived through any movie in the 90s, like that was a trope, right? This sort of broken, beautiful woman. And was it his own narcissism where he thought he could cure her that led him to his indiscretion as a psychiatrist, ultimately, to breach that doctor-patient purview? Or was it his narcissism as a man in the terms of seeing himself reflected back to him, his own brokenness? So those are things to keep in mind, especially as you get introduced to them as characters and you start to see how they interact with each other. You might want to look for that too. In the 1920s and 30s, color metaphor continues to be like a really popular literary device. I mean, it's always popular when you think about like the choice an author makes when they dress a character in a certain color, or they even like make a cover of a book a certain color. Like they're being informed by what we attribute to that color, what kind of feelings, what kind of connotations that we have with a color, you know. So the big example for Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby is, of course, anything with Daisy. She's white on the outside and yellow on the inside, like a literal daisy, but also this idea of purity covering up innocence, covering up the fact that the yellow center is kind of weak and cowardly. And then also, you know, that a daisy is a weed, so it's going to kill everything around it. But in Tender as the Night, the predominant color is black, and you're going to want to sort of keep your eye out for that and wonder, you know, is that calling back to nighttime, the sort of what are the stars in the sky sparkling in deep dark black? Is it people wearing black? Is it a mourning color, a sign of impending widowhood? Is it just a lack, like a vacuum or a black hole, a lack of feeling, a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding, or an ability to see light in any subject? So if you keep those little like nuggets in your head, then as you're reading, you'll be able to see them more clearly, and it might lead to a little bit more understanding of the novel in terms of when things get really dense or you've lost track of characters, you can still get something out of a sentence. And I think when people read classics, sometimes the language feels so far away. I mean, this book is going to be 100 years old soon. I mean, that's the reality. We live in 2024. This book was written in 1934. It's only 10 years away from being 100 years old. And when you link back on when you were reading books that were 100 years old, you know, if you were someone who graduated high school in the 80s, for example, then 100 years was 1880, and you're talking about books post-Civil War novels. So, you know, sometimes the language will move out of context faster, and you have to sort of start thinking about it from that perspective and look for those touchstones where you can like grab onto the language and look at what's still in our purview. So for example, the doctor-patient relationship is explored in all kinds of books, or in movies and television. The Sopranos, you know, is a huge example of the doctor-patient relationship where that breach happens. Now, it doesn't happen with a marriage, but you could argue that Tony Soprano and his analyst were having a relationship, an emotional relationship. And it continues to be a trope. The broken, beautiful woman continues to be a trope in a lot of books and novels. And it's kind of interesting to look back on what came before and how the history of literature or movies, whatever, started to inform and be regurgitated later on. And so that at the dawn of sort of the Hollywood era, 1934, you're talking about Gone with Wind has come out. There's like been some major film events. So suddenly these people, these ideas, these tropes are 10 feet tall on a screen, and they're bigger in our mind's eye as well. And Fitzgerald's writing at the inception of that idea. So when he has a character, a Hollywood character, who is 18, this young starlet, you know, he's seeing this firsthand also because he's moved to California. And then also, this is like new, this idea of a movie starlet at 18 having power is new. And we are so used to it now that what would it be like for that to have been a new concept for a reader to even start to begin to understand in their mind that an 18-year-old with a pretty face who's put on a movie screen could have more power than the adults in the room. So for this first session, I would ask you to read the sort of first 3 chapters. And they're in, you know, well, I guess I'll be a little mean as a teacher, maybe the first 5, because that'll put you in like, you know, the 30 page range. You can read the first 30 pages. And I think that in those 30 pages, you're going to be introduced to the idea of the French Riviera, and you're going to be introduced to some, of course, the early characters. There's a lot of water imagery, and I would keep your eyes peeled for mentions of any word that reflects in the title: nighttime, tender, tenderness, tenderly, etc., and start filing that away in your mind's eye as, again, these sort of breadcrumbs that will lead you through the novel. So next week, we'll kind of talk about the first few chapters and what I hope you got out of them. And in the meantime, I'll read the first paragraph for you. On the pleasant shore of the French Riviera, about halfway between Marseille and the Italian border, stands a large, proud, rose-colored hotel. Deferential palms cool its flush facade, and before it stretches a short, dazzling beach. Lately, it has become a summer resort of notable and fashionable people. A decade ago, it was almost deserted after its English clientele went north in April. Now many bungalows cluster near it, but when this story begins, only the cupolas of a dozen old villas rotted like water lilies among the massed pines between Gosse's Hôtel des Étrangers and Cannes, 5 miles away. So now that we've just finished with the Cannes Film Festival, this becomes a little more interesting, doesn't it? I hope you're well. Enjoy your classic.